Pluto in Aquarius, and the end of deafness, technology, medicine, and new paradigms for the human future. I'm following up on what I wrote several months ago regarding this transition, and adding something that stems from a perceptive question my wife, Ciro Discepolo Bosco Trecase, asked me in a YouTube video we posted online a few weeks ago. We were talking about my prediction, written and published on multiple platforms on the same day. Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte announced the start of the global COVID-19 pandemic. I declared myself very optimistic and published some numbers, and above all the balance of power, or extent, if you prefer, of the pandemic. At the end of the same period, in my book, which takes its name from this terrible global infection, I reiterated what I had predicted and drew on several epidemiological curves compiled by highly prestigious epidemiological institutes around the world, such as Cambridge and others. I also included some official tables from which one element stood out extraordinarily. During the years of the first major decline of the 21st century, in the planetary cyclic index, we had approximately 6 million deaths worldwide from COVID-19 between 2019 and 2022, and in the same period, as I had written very clearly years earlier, deaths from heart attacks, ischemic strokes, and cancer were enormously more numerous, approximately 342 million, 57 times higher. So in a recent YouTube video where we were discussing this and Daniela was interviewing me, her question was spontaneous, immediate, and legitimate. So does this mean that the mortality rate from cardiovascular disease and cancer is now declining? I replied that a reversal of the above representation on two ideal Cartesian axes had begun, but that this should be seen as the beginning of a long process. And now I'll try to explain myself better. We were talking about a basic concept, one of the main paradigms with which I've drafted global predictions, opposing those of political scientists, economists, historians, professional catastrophists, and even self-styled astrologers who spoke of the imminent end of the world, of World War III, with subsequent total thermonuclear war and the destruction of the planet, of Armageddon just around the corner, of Uranus's passage through the 29th degree of Taurus, of a new moon with a planetary cluster in April 2026, marking the start of the final apocalypse, and so on. I expressed exactly the opposite opinion and wanted to publish my predictions as soon as possible. I started writing the very day the first bombs fell on Tehran and stopped after 14 days, during which I worked almost continuously on my Algorithms of Destiny, published by Ricerca 90 Milan, 224 pages. I was saying that one of the paradigms guiding my personal worldview, also reiterated in that book, is the vision of the universe's breathing, and more specifically the breathing of our solar system, within a wide-angle lens, and absolutely avoiding the use of a telephoto lens, which would prevent us from having an overall view. I reiterate this again. From this perspective, if we limit ourselves to observing the planetary cyclic index curve from 2022 onwards with a magnifying glass, looking carefully at 2023, 2024, 2025, then we won't understand. In fact, to be able to numerically record a trend that has been rising for at least the last 100 years, it is even more necessary to have a wide-angle view, not a telephoto one. Every year, in fact, many hundreds of millions of people will continue to die from previous damages that, in my opinion, are not yet sufficiently stigmatized by world governments. I'm referring, for example, to the fact that almost all film and television productions continue to advertise smoking in a strictly prohibited manner in almost every scene of movies set in the West or Asia, both today and 100 years ago, producers prefer to pay hefty fines and advertise smoking profusely rather than completely ban it from all fiction. The same goes for spirits and, above all, the intensive use of cell phones held to the ear for many hours a day. The list of these appalling habits is very long, and obviously also includes uncritical and massive exposure to sunlight, car smog, fats in the diet, and so on. However, going back to what I emphasized regarding Pluto and Aquarius, I think the direction has already been reversed, and we are witnessing, right from the beginning of this cyclical event, leaps forward that are not just grand advertising announcements, but tangible realities that are already present in our current lives. I'm referring to the fact that for some years now, sight has been restored to the blind. Mobility has been restored to those who have been disabled for decades. The creation of specific avatars has allowed people who could no longer speak to make their voices heard. And above all, hearing has been restored to a huge portion of the world's population. This last point is the most specific focus of my brief essay today. However, before delving into it, I'd like to reiterate that in my opinion, we've already made a strong start, not in the very long term, or in the long run on reducing cancers, especially fatal ones. Increasingly large segments of the population are being educated about the dangers of close use of cell phones, computers, telephone masts, high voltage electrical cables, and so on, not to mention the direct risks posed by tobacco and spirits, but also by alcohol, especially since more and more companies producing de-alcohol-free beers are springing up in Bavaria. Mothers and fathers are increasingly careful about what they feed their children, and the hunt for less fatty and invasive foods has become a widespread social custom. Meanwhile, medicine and surgery, as I mentioned, are making giant strides also with the help of artificial intelligence. Consider the many different surgical operations, or rather microsurgical operations, that can be managed directly robotically and that ensure levels of success never achieved in previous decades. The RNA vaccine, which in my opinion legitimately faces many opponents for large-scale applications and is used on an absolutely massive scale, without the required prior screening, has nevertheless developed therapeutic techniques that already allow the production of personalized drugs that, in many cases of unique tumors, save countless lives. And this, of course, will advance exponentially in the coming years. We also know that for terrible and widespread diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, shockwave therapy is being used for the first time with exceptional results. And the list is truly long. But I believe my previous article on Pluto in Aquarius and this one, written with the utmost distance from political jargon, are clear enough that they don't require further effort on my part to explain, at least for now. We arrive then at what I already consider to be the first absolute, total, and irreversible victory on a global scale, that of human deafness. But before I further clarify my thoughts, allow me to take a step back on this topic. Many years before I published one of my best texts, in my opinion, The Foundations of Medical Astrology, Armenia Editore, Milan, 2006, 258 pages. I had written clearly in Italian and not in code my thoughts on deafness, which I attributed for the first time in the history of astrology absolutely to the sign of Aquarius or a strong Uranus in the natal chart. Today everyone is convinced of this, but almost no one remembers who discovered it. So I would like to recall 2 episodes from my distant past that made me experience very strong emotions, after which the suspicion that there was an absolute and very close connection between hearing and the Aquarius Leo axis was imprinted in my mind in very clear letters. The first painful episode. Between the late 1970s and early 1980s, a high school teacher came to see me who was completely deaf and whom I could talk to, because she could read lips. I asked her if her deafness diagnosis was definitive, and she replied yes, with a 90% chance of success. So there is hope, I asked. And she replied, yes, there is. A very talented Swiss surgeon, who practices near Zurich, considered the world's best, suggested I attempt a very difficult surgical procedure, the outcome of which is not guaranteed, to restore my hearing on one side. Nothing. I managed to convince the lady to try, but first by undergoing an exceptionally positive, targeted solar return. The procedure, among other things, was extremely expensive. The teacher proceeded, and as I learned later, everything went great because the person in question regained her hearing. This lady, whom I already classified as a classic Aquarius woman, as classic as it gets, also due to the strong 11th house values that characterize her natal chart, asked me for a new appointment, but not for a consultation. We met, and I will never forget the harsh words she had for me on that occasion. The lady essentially told me she would never consult me again, because before the surgery she lived in a kind of golden limbo, where she enjoyed such isolation, where disgust for humanity was a significant part of her quality of life. She strongly reproached me for having made her abandon the Shangri-La that was only in her head. Needless to say, this was a trauma for me, and I continued to think about it for years. Returning to it every day and trying to delve deeper into the archetypes and mythologies of Aquarius, I began to understand at least half of people strongly characterized by this sign at birth, or by an equally strong Uranus, develop over the years extreme forms of selfishness, where they absolutely don't want to listen to what others say, and that's it. Studying thousands of people, even from this perspective, I collected and catalogued in my good memory thousands and thousands of similar cases, and this also brought to mind the figure of my maternal grandmother, Grandma Amalia, who was totally deaf, with whom I had a difficult relationship when I was in my 20s, and hadn't yet studied astrology. Only years later did I study her birth chart, and many things came back to me. Grandma Amalia, as I said, was totally deaf, and I decided to give her a gift. I built her a small amplifier with excellent headphones, which I plugged directly into the television in the guest house near our house where she lived. I remember the owner of that guest house making me sign a document declaring that if the TV broke, I would pay for the damages. I did so without hesitation because I was already in Aries, the sun 3 degrees below the ascendant, who was hard to stop. The results regarding this specific aspect of our relationship were extraordinary, because my grandmother greatly enjoyed being able to decide, even for just an hour a day, to open up to the outside world. And now we come to the second episode, much more dramatic than the previous one. One day a woman came to me for a consultation, accompanied by her husband and sister. They remained in the living room next to my office, and I spoke to the woman. I remember very clearly that the woman's voice was always lower than usual. The husband, as I discovered shortly afterward, began eavesdropping at the door, and when his wife mentioned an Aquarius lover, the husband, who I later learned was a Leo, burst into the room and, shouting, threatened his wife with telling him who this Aquarius was. The tone immediately turned tragic, and even today I am convinced that there could have been a live femicide at that moment. This episode, quite dramatic for me, also troubled me for years and prompted countless reflections on hearing, on Leo, and on its ability in general to hear even the quietest whispers, unlike its sign Aquarius, just 180 degrees away. Isn't it true that Leo, considered the king of the jungle, can hear the slightest noises from its potential prey, precisely because it is endowed with an exceptional hearing system? For years I also pondered the fact that many Leos speak in a very low voice, partly because they believe everyone possesses the same hearing power, but also for a less noble psychological reason. Others must prick up their ears when he distributes his pearls. So these were the starting points. You'll find many of my writings that discuss this, including in relation to astrological portraits I've drawn over the decades of famous Aquarians and Leos. And so we come to my statement today. We're talking about a medical problem that's been completely solved. We could say 100% for almost all of humanity. In fact, in the space of a couple of years, we've gone from tiny smart hearing aids with a whole series of electronic filters to glasses for the deaf. And finally, news from just a few hours ago, to the possibility of using Apple AirPods as highly advanced AI-assisted hearing aids. In practice, within a year or two at most, with the free market and similar, even very high-quality Chinese products, for around €200, all the deaf people in the world will no longer be deaf, and not least by simply setting a flag on their cell phones. They can turn off their headphones whenever they want. The next step will be the new frontiers of medicine that will prevent billions of human beings from becoming deaf. But already today, thanks above all to Pluto's passage into Aquarius, deafness has been definitively conquered.